The first thing I wanted to talk about just a little bit today before we get into the text is the idea of sexual yoga in Tibetan Buddhism, because there are a lot of references to that in here, and so I wanted to provide just a little bit of clarification on this. So these guidelines are appropriate for householders. Monks and nuns take vows of celibacy. Most householders do not. And so the practices that are described in the Guhyagarbha are practices that can be done without violating vows and so forth for householders, at least as long as you've not taken a vow of celibacy. But within that, I wanted to just talk about two or three things here. One of them is exploitation. Exploitation is never appropriate, whether it's coming from a teacher to a student or a student to a teacher or between and among students, whatever. So that involves taking advantage of somebody else for one's own pleasure or benefit. So we certainly want to avoid those kinds of things. And then secondly, we want to follow the ethical principles of Buddhism. And so there's a number of those, but certainly things like do good, or at least do no harm, for the benefit of all beings. Avoiding sexual misconduct, which primarily focuses on adultery, but could be underage children and those kinds of things as well, or non-consensual sex between adults. The intent of doing these practices is not about one's personal passion, but about practice and transcending ordinary desire and attachment. So you need to have the appropriate intent when you do these things. There is one in the Mother Tantra vows about never disparaging a female. So we don't ever want to do that. And then, generally speaking, the male does not emit semen during these practices unless it's part of where that is specified in the text. The empowerments and occasionally in sadhanas, that's included. This one seems to have several places where that is indicated, although as the commentary indicates, that can be just a visualized practice or an actual karmamudra practice. In terms of different forms of sexual yoga, one of the forms is what I refer to as just sacred sex. When we're doing tantra practice, we are supposed to have pure view at all times. And so if you have sex with a partner or somebody like that you normally would have sex with, then just maintaining that sense of pure view when you're doing it, a sacred outlook in that context, would certainly be appropriate as a part of that. The visualization practice, the jnanamudra practice without a human consort, is also an appropriate practice, and it's the predominant way of doing these practices today. In some cases, I've read a few things that talk about masturbation as an alternative, where you want to have some physical stimulation associated with that during the visualization, but without an actual human consort. So that might be an option available for that purpose. But again, the intent still needs to be oriented toward the practice, not just having an orgasm or something. And then the generation stage, these practices are very rarely done with the generation stage, but I have run across a few descriptions where they are, and this is primarily a generation stage practice, so I thought that we should mention it here. That typically what you do in those cases are you practice until you've really mastered the particular practice, the sadhana, and then if you have a qualified partner, then you can go ahead and do the practice with that partner, so that the visualization and so forth where it describes the two coming together in union could be done in that way as a part of a generation stage practice. The most common place where the sexual yogas are practiced are in the completion stage practices. And they're done basically the same way that you would do them in a generation stage practice. The completion stage practices per se don't really change, but you insert there's usually a section where it describes various practices that the two partners do to stimulate and arouse each other sexually as a part of that before they actually enter into union together. And so that would be true in the completion stage practice as well. But then the practices you would do would be the things like the Tumo practice and the four blisses and the four empties and the union of those two together, that kind of thing. The clear light could be a part of that as well. So those aren't particularly unusual. It's just that you do them together in union with a qualified consort. And in some very rare cases, these are also done in Togao practices. I haven't run across very much describing that, but I have seen references to that being done. So when you would be doing the visualization, you could be doing the visualization while in union with a qualified consort. So the qualified consort in this case, as it was described in our book, was somebody who has had the empowerment, who has done the basic practices so that they have some background and understanding of doing these practices, at least at this particular level. Some cases they say that the person needs to have an understanding of the view, of emptiness, and some of those other kinds of things as well, that they need to have completed the completion stage practices and so forth. So there are slightly different understandings sometimes about what qualified actually means, but I think either of these are close enough that you get the idea that you don't do these practices with somebody who really doesn't know what it is all about and how to engage in these practices appropriately and the intent that is appropriate for these kinds of practices. So that's just a brief summary, give you a little bit of background in terms of that. I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, but at least summarize a lot of that for you.